I'll just kick us off for this one and then move it on to Abdel-Azim. Thank you both for giving the time. My name is Ali Al-Azhari. I work for the Endeavor Egypt office. Welcome to everyone in this webinar session. So Endeavor Egypt launched this series of virtual webinars with different members from our network of 42 markets to discuss different topics that are relevant to the global macro conditions, shed some light on global trends and opportunities, and share inspiring stories such as Luca's story. So this is our fifth webinar. We're happy to have Luca Ferrari, co-founder and CEO of Bending Spoons, an Endeavor entrepreneur, Endeavor Italy entrepreneur, to share his journey building and scaling Bending Spoons to have served 1 billion people across the globe so far through a suite of digital products like Evernote, Meetup, Splice, StreamYard, and WeTransfer, and others. The conversation will be moderated by Abdel-Azim Osman, co-founder and CPO of Nawy, and an Endeavor Egypt entrepreneur. Nawy is Africa's leading prop tech with a dedicated team of more than 800 professionals that drive hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues. So we're excited also to welcome an audience today from more than 40 countries, 40, truly exemplifying Endeavor's global network. So for the audience, please make this an interactive session. Luca and Abdel-Azim will chat for 20 minutes, and then the floor will open up for questions that can be submitted in the Q&A section. Abdel-Azim, over to you.
Thank you, Ali, for the intro. And thank you, Luca, for being here. I think Luca's an exceptional individual and an exceptional Endeavor mentor. The first time I met him was during my ISP in Rome, and I was completely blown away by the way he structured his thought and how he's kind of built his businesses from the ground up. So thank you for being here, Luca.
Thank you. No, it's a pleasure. You're too kind.
I guess for the first question is, and this is very unique, I guess, to Luca, is for me, building a company is extremely challenging. I know there are many entrepreneurs on this call, but Luca's actually done something that's actually extraordinary. He bootstrapped his company to over 100 million in revenue. So the first question is, how were you able to do that?
Yeah, right. You're right. We are currently around 700 million. And I think the first time we raised capital, significant capital, was late last year. I think you have to have a model that enables that. It's not just about how good you are. Some strategies, you can do that. Others you can't. Like take Tesla, arguably one of the most exceptional entrepreneurial successes of all time. There's no way you're gonna bootstrap that to any amount of revenue. There's way too much upfront investment you need to make before you can even sell a car, right? So I don't think that you can determine whether an entrepreneur has done a good job or not, depending on how much money they've raised in isolation. Although certainly I would say I don't subscribe to the ethos that for an entrepreneur, the more team members you have, the more money you've raised, the cooler you should feel, because those are, in a way, means to your entrepreneurial ends and to the company's ends. Those are resources, and the more efficiently you can do it in a way, the better you've done. So in our case, we could bootstrap to a substantial amount of revenues without raising equity because the model we came up with enables it. The way we operate, not everybody in the call may know, is we build a platform of technologies, expertise, talents, brand, data, company culture that's optimized for acquiring digital technology businesses with untapped potential and then running them even more successfully than they previously were. And so what we do is go out in the world and acquire indeed digital technology businesses and then come up with a vision for them, for a version of that business that we think will make it maximally successful in the long run. And that will span the gamut. It will include organization, technology, user experience, interface, monetization, marketing, you name it. And then we try to close the gap between the status quo and that vision as quickly and as fully as we can. And we do so with by getting our hands dirty. Most of us are software engineers, AI researchers, product managers, growth managers, product designers, so on and so forth. Sometimes I like to joke that Bending Spoons is a bit like Google and a private equity firm had a baby. It's the best metaphor I've been able to come up with. So that model although it's definitely far from straightforward to make it profitable and so be able to scale it without raising equity, at least you can. It's possible. And so we did.
Okay, and I guess that kind of leads to my second question is, so you went all the way to building towards $100 million in revenue bootstrap, and then you went extreme to the other side where I think you raised over $500 million all at once. What was the shift that made you decide that you wanted to raise, and why did you go for such a big round?
Yeah, actually, the media do not do a good job at portraying facts accurately. So I think we should separate debt financing from equity financing. Equity financing, and equity financing also, I think it would be best to separate secondary and primary. Secondary doesn't tell you much about how well you're running the company. It's simply some shareholders selling and others coming in, but it doesn't impact the company much. Primary means you're raising financing, and that's a bad thing in theory unless you can use it well. Let's talking primary financing equity. All in all, we have raised about $150 million, of which about $50 million in the summer of 2023 and $100 million early this year. So we had raised essentially no equity throughout the first 10 years of our history, and then we raised around $150 million over 2 rounds, connected rounds. There isn't much of a trend there. There was nothing. We did it basically once, and at the moment we're not planning to raise more equity anytime soon. Why did we raise equity? Because of 2 reasons. Number one, our strategy, like I described before, is so business acquisition centric. To acquire businesses, we use debt and also our own cash flows, of course, but debt enables you to move faster, grow faster, be more efficient. And lenders are more comfortable lending if there is an institutional equity investor who has confirmed what you're doing makes sense by investing at a certain valuation. So at some point, we were getting to a scale where lenders were looking forward to seeing a top tier equity investor formally approved of the company by investing. And so we brought in some great investors to that. And the second reason is when you acquire companies like we do, often you have to be very fast. Companies become available for an acquisition all of a sudden. Say the board decides a sale is in the cards, and then you cannot tell them, "Hey, great, I'd love to acquire this company, but give us 6 months to raise equity." You have to be able to provide the financing very, very quickly. Now, if you have had equity investors for some time on board, they know you well, they know the business well. If they're deep-pocketed, like the ones we brought on board, and they can provide the financing even within a week's notice, very quickly, they don't have to do due diligence and get and so now we have them on board. If a situation like this presents itself, we'll be able to raise equity accordingly.
Yeah, I think I agree with
that
you.
part. Sorry, just people may be wondering, but so what about the $500 million? There was a confusion in whatever journalists reported that around the same time we raised an additional $300 and something million in debt, entirely separate from the equity raise. And so they took it and put it all together and said, "Oh, $500 million." Like you can sum them together, but it's really different uses and different sources, definitely. In terms of debt, we've always raised debt, and it's been kind of constant relative to our EBITDA. Simply as we got bigger and more profitable, the absolute amounts of debt got bigger. 4 weeks ago, we raised $700 million in debt. I don't think it was widely reported for some reason, but so if you ask me in 1 year's time, I'll probably tell you that we've raised more than $1 billion. So that part has been a constant throughout our history. It's only the equity part that was a spike.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you, especially when it comes to acquisitions. Timing is everything, because it's a timing of when that entity is ready to sell and you having the resources to do it and closing it in the right time. If you miss that time window, a lot of times you've lost that opportunity. Okay, my next question is related to challenges. There are a lot of entrepreneurs on this call. Everyone goes through challenges. Some of them are similar, some of them are very different. I guess in your experience or your journey, what were the biggest challenges that you faced, and how do you approach a challenge when you don't necessarily know the answer?
Yeah, I think my biggest challenge has been questioning. Like, I'm very proud of what we built and we build. Sometimes I wonder whether I'm doing the right thing, not to be trying to cure cancer or something. Not that I would succeed at that, but just I feel you want to use your talents in the best way possible, and you know, I've been wondering whether there are even better ways I could do so that would benefit the world more than what we've been doing. Again, although I'm extremely proud of what we've been doing. So that's a challenge I've had. Introspection in that regard has been something I've been dealing with pretty much nonstop in my professional life. And certainly there are plenty of challenges. I was saying another one that I've encountered repeatedly and I'm pretty bad at is I think by nature I tend to care a lot about. I don't like to bring bad news, to do something that disappoints someone. And in general, I think as an entrepreneur, as a manager, even more so with a model like ours where we acquire companies and the whole point is to try to make very deep changes to try to make them a lot more successful. You always frustrate, anger, disappoint numerous people. And dealing with that has been a challenge. I've gotten a little bit better with time. You grow a thicker skin, but certainly not an easy one for me. Maybe others would have been able to deal with it more comfortably. And then, of course, there are challenges on a daily basis. Try to make decisions. There is a high degree of ambiguity, often balancing benefits, risks. I think everybody here can probably come up with many such examples. My solution to overcoming a challenge is, on the one hand, try to use my brain as much as I can. Not because it's particularly good, but because it's the best I've got. So try to contain, mitigate my biases, use my logic, rationality, then leverage other brains around me. I'm surrounded by bright people. I try to ask for their counsel. And so, I encourage them to use their logic, rationality, keep their biases at bay. So really reasoning. There's a reason why, once the Enlightenment became so popular and, as a movement, also as a species, as humanity, we have seen such an uptick in growth, innovation, improvement in many facets of our lives. That's because at its heart, the Enlightenment movement is about using reason to look at the world, understand the world, solve problems, build a vision you have, as opposed to emotion, gut feeling, myth in any shape or form. And so using reason is the weapon I've tried to resort to as much as I could. Now, the problem is we've got a lot of emotions and they're a wonderful thing most of the time, but when you try to use reason to solve a problem, you've got to try to set them aside, and that's quite challenging. So I would say developing emotional intelligence over time, which to me, part of that is being able to analyze your emotions without being overwhelmed by them, directed by them. That's something, an ability I've tried to train, and I made some progress on that, but certainly far from perfect.
Okay, so I think you kind of touched on one of my questions, so I'm going to change the order around. But one of the things that struck me at our ISP was you talked a lot about hiring top talent and hiring the A people or the superstars, because superstars like to work with superstars. And if you can build that kind of cult in your company, then you go places. And one of the difficulties I've personally faced or had, and I know a lot of people probably face this as well, is at certain stages in your company who was someone who was an A employee or a super performer may not meet the demands or the expectations at a later stage in your company. And I faced a lot of difficulty having to deal with those people and having to decide if we need to hire someone with more experience that they report to, or if maybe Nawy's not the right company for them anymore. And I think you had some very clear answers and a very clear approach to that. So I'd like you to elaborate a bit about what you've done in those situations.
Yeah, I'll say it's extremely difficult to deal with insufficient performance from anybody really, because it's never nice to have to bring bad news, regardless of exactly the extent of the bad news. And even more so when it's someone you've been working closely with, and therefore presumably you have developed a close bond with. Taking a step back though, I will say we'll always try to hire for talent versus experience. In talent, we include a lot of things, not just being brilliant, but also hardworking, tenacious, collaborative, having high integrity. With talent, let's say in talent, when I say talent, I include all of those traits that are more on the fixed side. Like on all of these things you can improve, but they're a little bit more about who you are than skills you can learn. And then we provide people with experience. Now, the downside of that is you have to be more patient, because if people don't know how to do something yet, they will not be proficient immediately. Coaching needs to be provided. Time needs to be waited until they're highly competent. On the bright side, though, this type of person tends to grow and scale with the company potentially indefinitely. Indeed, today, if I look at most of what you would consider top management positions, including all of the, let's say, general managers we have leading our business units, you mentioned some of our products before, pretty much all of them, with maybe one exception, have grown from inside, from a place of very limited experience and typically zero experience to where they are now. So we have not had to change pretty much anybody in top management positions as we grew, and we have grown. I think we had very good results, and we are at a pretty substantial scale at this point, probably a larger scale than most of the companies whose entrepreneurs are on the call, I would imagine. I think when people see that their colleagues get stuck, it's more when you hired someone with mediocre talents, but perhaps an adequate level of experience for that particular juncture. Because if talent is modest, then it also means the ability to learn is modest. So my first piece of advice is, as much as you can, try to hire for talent and then be a little bit more patient, but I think it'll pay off in the very long run, sometimes even in the short run. Most of the jobs we do are not rocket science. You don't need to have built rockets for 10 years to know how to do it. It's being a good person when it comes to reasoning, being dependable, being hardworking, will typically bring a bigger contribution almost immediately relative to having more experience but being lacking in these areas. Having said that, you certainly face situations where someone is not pulling their weight, whether it's because they hit ceiling or they never did pull their weight. And my suggestion there is to definitely, provide feedback, be candid, give a second chance, but ultimately, if things don't improve fairly rapidly, part ways with the person. It doesn't help anybody to not do so. It only helps you avoid the discomfort, but it doesn't help the person feel empowered. Over time, people want to feel they're in their position because they're doing a good job, not because people are afraid of telling them they're not. And elsewhere, they might be appreciated more, grow more, feel more satisfied. I find highly non-meritocratic, because there's a person out there, they just don't have a name, you don't know their face and name, but there's a person out there who would love to fill that position and work their ass off to deserve it, and you're not giving them a chance because of your lack of courage or resolve. Needless to say, it doesn't help your company. and all their colleagues whose livelihoods and success depend at least a little bit on that particular position being staffed appropriately. So, nobody said being an entrepreneur is easy. Certainly, going through emotional discomfort is a big part of it. So you just do it. And over time, as you see life goes on, it gets a little bit easier, but it's never entirely easy, of course.
Okay, I think you touched on the points, and what you said at the ISB is you try to separate your emotions, and being candid is more important, right? If someone's stuck in a job where they're not performing, then they probably don't feel good about themselves. And delaying that conversation is probably hurting them as much as it is hurting the company. And maybe just being candid and giving them a safe exit is better for them and allowing them the opportunity to land on their feet somewhere that better suits what they want to do.
Yeah. So there's a misconception, I feel, by the way, especially in some countries and some cultures, that you can guarantee someone's a job. You can't. Jobs are a scarce resource. It's not like friendship. You can tell someone, "Hey, I'm your friend." Like, I wouldn't say probably it's not entirely unlimited friendship, but in theory, you can be friends with as many people as you care to be. But jobs are a scarce resource. They can only exist where ultimately in the long run they add value, and the pairing with the person is critical to that. So once you get out of the concept that you can guarantee someone's a job, that just doesn't exist. You can only do so temporarily, and probably by doing more harm than good. Certainly to society, perhaps even to the person in many cases, not every case, I'm sure sometimes. Then you start looking at this more holistically, more long term, and it's a little bit easier to take that difficult step. And again, I'm not saying taking it lightly. I always recommend giving feedback, giving a second chance. But when you have exhausted a reasonable amount of B plans, then you have to have resolve, move quickly.
Okay. So I'm mindful, I've got a lot more questions, but I'm also mindful that part of this webinar is we're supposed to open it up to the audience to ask questions. So at this point, I'd like to open up. If people want to ask questions, they can start typing them in, and we'll start selecting a few. And while people are doing that, maybe one thing that a lot of people may not know about Luca is at one point, I think Elon Musk tried to headhunt his head of recruiting or his HR director, and I believe it was a she. I don't remember if it was a guy or a girl, but that person ended up she turned down the job, and I was wondering if you had some insights on why she turned down the job and preferred to continue doing what she was doing.
I think she loves the company. She loves working together. But the opportunity was great. A lot of responsibility, slightly better pay. Elon Musk is Elon Musk. Tesla is Tesla. So I felt extremely privileged, very motivated by the fact that she chose us. She didn't even seem to have any doubts about that. At least I didn't perceive that to be the case as we discussed the matter. I'm very grateful. You should never take for granted the help, support, and collaboration of those around you. Ultimately, I find that the people you work with, besides your family and friends, are among the main factor of purpose, fun, learning in life. It's certainly the case for me. So try to be mindful of that, grateful, and make it count. Don't wait for them to tell you they're leaving before you make them feel important. You give them responsibility. You recognize their value. I know it's not easy to do because we're all so busy, and sometimes you take people for granted, but that's a mistake to be avoided if possible.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think it's a lot of validation when someone with that star power and success is unable to headhunt from you. So great job on building that culture. So let me open it up to one of the first questions that came in. I'm not sure. The question should show up on people's screens. Do you see this question, Luca, or do you want me to read it out?
I can open. There's a Q&A here, but I see several questions.
Okay, let me read it out. So this is from an anonymous attendee, and the question is, what was your biggest setback and how did you overcome it?
Yeah, I've had many. Well, I had a failed startup before. I worked for 3 years on a startup called Evertail. We were trying to build a self-writing diary with AI. This was 2010 through 2013. The time AI was not really discussed outside of academia. And we poured our hearts and souls into that project. Not just myself, we all worked so incredibly hard. So that was, heartbreaking, that failure, but also we felt exhilarated to try again. I don't know how I overcame it. I think the exhilaration of trying again and while leveraging all the learning from that failure was bigger than the disappointment for having failed. And I also felt very fortunate. In hindsight, that was a major blessing that my two co-founders at the time, they also co-founded Benisons with me. Our friendship was so deep, so strong that I felt that I had a foundation with them, someone backing me, and of course I was backing them. And I appreciated working together so much that I felt I'd rather fail again, but while trying with them than maybe take a job somewhere and have a more certain outcome. So friendship and probably my natural inclination toward trying to build things and face challenges where it kind of saved me there.
Okay, I think
Yeah.
it's a
Just
great
in the interest of covering more questions, so shut up. I guess we've
That's
talked about
fine.
many
We love,
setbacks.
we love to listen to you. I think there's another question, and this one might be a bit more personal to every entrepreneur. And the question is, a potential acquirer is approaching us already. We're a Series A stage company. How would you advise to evaluate our company, especially as an entrepreneur? I ask myself, is my work done? So I guess the first part of this question, Luca, is when do you feel that your work is done and you're ready to exit? If you ever think you'll get to that point, and how would you evaluate?
I think it's difficult to answer. In general, I would say I'm a big believer in there is no solving a problem unless you know your objectives. Every time people ask me something like this, I say, okay, first tell me what your goals are. Only once we know the goals can we problem solve backward from those and determine whether selling the company is the right thing. For example, I feel a strong sense of responsibility toward our share owners. Even if we were to receive an acquisition offer where I knew, for example, I would be replaced as a CEO, and I felt like I do now that I have a lot more to give. I really want to build this company a lot further, but the offer were great for share owners and clearly in their interest to be accepted. I would probably reluctantly accept it because I would otherwise feel I would betray their trust. But if that's not a key priority, then it could be totally different. It could be if someone is prioritizing for their own learning or enjoyment or glory or whatever. Like I would recommend really focus on what your goals, objectives, principles, and then problem solve backward from there. Once those are clear, I think someone like me or many others could then they could help. But absent those, and those things are almost axioms. There's no right and wrong. It's not a religious diktat that you have to do what's in your share owner's best interests. Like I believe that's probably the right thing to do most of the time, but it's not a law of physics. So you have to decide what's important to you.
Okay, so I guess the next two questions are kind of similar from Guillermo and from Alan. And the first one is elaborate on the Google and if Google and PE had a baby comment. And like how do you see yourself different than a traditional private equity? And is there a common theme or purpose in the products that you integrate in your portfolio?
Right. So the commons, I'll start from the end. No, there's no common theme or purpose. We actually try to actively keep them as separate as we can and let our business units operate highly autonomously. We think that breeds sense of ownership, entrepreneurship, satisfaction, speed, agility. In that way, we're more like Procter & Gamble. For those of you who know them, like they have all of these massively successful consumer brands, but most people don't even know they're all owned by Procter & Gamble. So the synergies are behind the scenes, so to say, in the functional knowledge and the processes, the abilities, and we're similar in that regard. So the Google private equity baby thing. Well, the one thing we have in common with private equity is that we rely massively on acquisitions. Other than that, I would say we're as different as it gets. For example, private equity firms invest other people's money. They have funds they invest. We use our own balance sheet, and that's our money. Like the founders, we still own 3/4 of the company, almost like 2/3. Much of the rest is in the hands of some of our colleagues. We don't raise money to invest it. We only raise it if needed to, because we lack a little bit of capital to pay for purchase price. But our intention is generally to just use our existing balance sheet to the extent possible. Private equity firms typically have to sell within 4, 5, 6 years. So they make decisions with that timeline in mind, relatively short-term minded. We buy to own forever. We've never sold a business, and so all of our decisions are with the longest possible time frame in mind. That's how we look at everything. All of these companies, they're ours, and we intend to keep them that way for decades, potentially. So we try to think 10 or 20 years out if we can. And the third big difference, the private equity, is we are incredibly hands-on. We will rebuild the organization if need be. We will rebuild the technology from the ground up. The code, we have often rewritten the whole code. We will change the user experience, user interface, monetization, marketing. So most of us, 80% of the workforce, we are people in technical or hands-on roles: product managers, growth managers, software engineers, researchers, product designers. Private equities, they generally have a small team of finance people, and that's it. So it's entirely different. Why Google? Well, the Google metaphor captures all of these differences. So Google acquires companies to hold them forever. They are hands-on in everything they do, technical people like we are, and they invest off their balance sheet. So why not just Google? Because, well, they also launch products we mostly acquire. Hence, I think private equity plus Google is the closest metaphor I've been able to come up with to describe management.
Okay, I guess the next question is back to related how you said that you look for talent above experience when hiring. And the question is, what's your process for what you look like? What do you look like when you're looking for talent? And what kind of tasks do you ask candidates when you're interviewing them or trying to hire them?
So I like to say that we look for smart people who care. The smart part is pretty straightforward. Who care should also be, for the most part, but it means, hardworking, strong sense of ownership, proactive. Really, they just want to do a great job, help the company succeed. I started off with a bias for the smart part. I'm now more biased toward the care part. I'd rather work with someone smart, but not necessarily a genius or anything like that, who cares tremendously, than with someone who's almost a genius but doesn't care too much, for sure. How do you measure those things? Well, by no means are we perfect at it. It's a constant investment and struggle. We invest heavily in this stuff. We have a team of 30, I would say roughly 30 people probably, working on talent, recruiting, tests, analyzing the data, iterating, building tools, technologies just for this. The reasoning part is a little bit easier. You can build reasoning tests, and there is a huge amount of debate what's most effective or not, and we found some that are better than others. But I think already screening for people who can complete successfully logically challenging tasks will help you get someone who's reasonably good at that, and that'll probably be good enough to start with. The care part is harder, and I think there are two ways to look at it. The first one is someone a person who cares in general? If they choose to do something, they want to do a great job at it. You can try to assess that by looking at their track record. Have they excelled where they chose to do something? Did they progress rapidly in a job? Did they do well academically? Did they do a lot of projects where, although the project perhaps wasn't successful, they clearly showed massive effort in, say, the quality of the output, or whatever it is. You can collect references and ask people, is this person hardworking, dependable, determined? But then the second part is, will they be motivated in the job with you? And I think there's it's partly you can figure that out by describing very clearly what it feels like to work at your company in that job. But I find the only way ultimately is to test them. And so I'm a big fan of trying people out. Hire people, maybe, tell them, hey, let's try for 1 year, see how it goes. And if both parties are ecstatic, let's continue indefinitely, or else we'll part ways. Be generous with supporting people. If you want to part ways, don't try to do it cheaply. Make sure that it's smooth for them. But yeah, ultimately you gotta test people. It's really hard just on paper or through testing off the job, let's say. At least we haven't cracked the code of that.
Okay, following up on that same line, there's a question that says, what do you do to make your new employees passionate about their work? Do you feel, and I guess I'm going to add a part, do you feel that you play a big role in that, or there are people who naturally care and are naturally passionate about what they're doing?
Yeah, we don't try. I mean, I think the work is the work. What you can do is, and also you don't. So I don't believe in the motivational speeches like William Wallace and Braveheart. I love the movie; it makes me shiver, but I don't believe in real life. Yeah, maybe in a situation like that, but ultimately it's not a 20-minute battle. It's a multi-year effort. Any such a speech will have a short-term impact, as far as I can tell. Also, I don't believe in building jobs that are not what you need simply because you think they're cooler and people will want them more. I think you need to build an organization that's optimal for whatever strategy you have, and then find the people who will want to work in those jobs. You can make some changes. You can mix and match jobs, merging them, splitting them to try to meet what the demands and expectations and preferences of people you can hire. But ultimately, the same set of tasks need to be done. You can package them in different jobs, but the same set of tasks need to be done. So what I believe in is try to match people with these tasks through jobs well. So sell them for what they are. Don't make them sound too much cooler. So then you make sure that people who come on board are excited to do them. If someone is not excited, try to part ways with them. What you can do is you can provide a good example. I think a lot of things can be interesting, but someone needs to ignite a little bit of a flame in you. But again, that's, in my view, done through example. Show that you're passionate, show that you're hardworking, hands-on, and some people will respond to that. Yeah, but ultimately, be realistic about it. It's not a matter of patting someone on the shoulder or shouting. It's that won't work in my experience.
Okay. And
much of it, by the way, you can just be empathetic. Try to stand in people's shoes. Do you think you all of a sudden get excited about a job because your CEO or whatever gave a speech? Like, really, do you think you'd be excited 3 months out? Or would you be excited if you have a lot of responsibility, autonomy, if your CEO or your colleagues are they kick ass, they're hardworking, intelligent, dependable, humble people? Like, I think if you just try to stand in people's shoes, you will see that there are things you can do that may be effective, and you will immediately discard a lot of things that are obviously not going to be effective.
I completely agree with you. And I think part of what I've found personally is when you hire people with empathy, people who care about not letting their teammates or their colleagues down, then they go a lot further than people who are maybe more self-centered or selfish about their own personal career. So another question here, and I have a very strong opinion about this, but I'm not the one being interviewed, so I'll pass it over to Luca. What is your opinion about people who are starting or wanting to start their own company while doing another job, especially if they're younger, like a fresh graduate? Do you think that works, or?
Well, I guess in theory it can. I'm sure it has occasionally, but I think taking a company off the ground is so hard. And the success rate is so dismal if you're focused that I think it becomes tiny if you're doing something else. Now, there are situations where that may be the only way forward. Like you literally have absolutely no money, you need to earn a living, and okay, then great, try and do it in your free time. But if you can run the company even on a shoestring full time, I would highly recommend that. Particularly if you have no family, particularly if you're young. I think the risk of running is minor, modest. Perhaps it's actually a negative risk, meaning that you're better off than continuing along a more structured career. It's not that companies don't value people who have an entrepreneurial experience. It's a great sign of being proactive, having initiative, determination. So I would say just take the leap. But then I would also say if someone needs encouragement, maybe it's not for them. I find that, again, this is so hard. If I think about all the hard work, hard aches, sleepless nights for 14 years now, including this week, it's not that it gets tremendously better. I think someone would give up very, very early if they don't have it in them to just pursue this. So if someone needs encouragement, perhaps they already have their answer.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. If you have a way out or a backup plan, then it's very easy to let go. If you're not 100% invested, it's very easy to decide this is too difficult. Let me go back to my normal career. So here's another question that I also know the answer to, but I'll throw it over to Luca. Is acquiring companies requires a lot of money. How much money did you and your co-founders start with?
Very little by most standards. We started with $40,000. And that money, it's a funny story. So we had a startup before I mentioned. We raised €1 million, $1 million for it. And at the end, we were left with about 40,000 in the bank. And the project was a failure. We wanted to liquidate it. The money was the VCs because of liquidation preferences, but the administrative burden to go through a multi-shareholder liquidation process was too much for this VC for it to be worth it to them, considering they would only retrieve $40,000, which for them was a tiny sum. And so they sold their shares to the three of us for €1, so a nominal amount. And we liquidated the company and got a little bit less than 40,000 out of it. And that was our seed money. And the first acquisition, we paid $10,000 for it. The rest went into paying for our subsistence salaries, putting a roof over our heads. And then, you turn 10 into 20, and then you invest the 20 and turn 20 into 40. Compounding is an exponential effect. It's quite powerful. So 10 years later, now we're in a position where we're looking at companies where the purchase price would be over $1 billion. But of course, at the time, that was not within reach.
Okay, and I guess another question here is, are you more proactive or reactive when buying companies? Like, do you go out and look for the companies you want to buy, or do you spot an opportunity where a company's potentially wanting to do a sale and then you start looking at them?
We try to saturate both opportunities. You want to do as much of that as you can. I would say probably, if I look at acquisitions closed, a little bit more reactive, like 70-30 or 60-40. So companies setting up a sales process, and then you get to know that exists, and you bid and you win. That's probably 2 out of 3 acquisitions we've closed in the past couple of years. But it's close. I mean, both methods are quite important, I think.
Okay, and back to having the right people in place. When you acquire a company, I guess sometimes they might have all the right people working there, but I know in your case, there were cases where almost everyone working at one of those companies weren't the people that you wanted on board. How did you approach having to lay off almost the whole culture or the whole staff there?
I mean, the short of it is transparency, honesty. Like, that's true always. We try. It's one of our core values. I mentioned candor earlier in talking to your colleagues. I think in general, be honest. So just being very transparent with people that you're even considering something like that. I believe, we're all adults. Just give them the knowledge so that they can plan their lives accordingly. It's unusual. Most companies will make all the decisions and then one day show up and say, okay, there's this layoff, these people are impacted, it's done. Your last day is tomorrow, today, bye. This naturally reduces the period of uncertainty. It's a little bit like if one communication done and the deal is done. But I find it not fully respectful because maybe you had known for weeks or even months and you had kept people in the dark. So just be transparent. That we have found that people, they don't like it, but they respect you more if you at least treat them as adults. You give them the option of planning their lives, deciding what they want to do with it. And the fear that they will destroy the company or something. They're not psychopaths. People have integrity 99 times out of 100. And particularly if you treat them with respect, they will react as professionals. And the second piece of advice is try to be generous with their transition financially, so with all sorts of support, so that their landing is as soft as it gets under what's obviously very undesirable circumstances. It doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it pleasant for anybody involved, but it makes it a little bit less bad. And so that's what you can do, I think.
Okay, the next question is related to Evertail and your first failed startup, because a lot of times people forget that most entrepreneurs don't succeed from their first try, and the learnings you get from your failures are probably more important from the successes. What was the biggest learning you had from that failed startup?
I'll mention two quickly. One is invest a lot in thinking through your idea, your plan, and validating it. Doing a thorough validation typically takes 5% of the time it takes to execute the full thing. So don't. Many people, especially inexperienced entrepreneurs, just jump the gun and get into implementation mode immediately out of the enthusiasm because they got the idea and they think it's genius. No, I've done it. I know. But that's a terrible idea. If you invest a little bit more time to validate it, 9 times out of 10 you can determine that it's a terrible idea, and you'll spare yourself 2-3 years of pain and suffering for no real benefit. The second learning is the people really matter a lot. The most important thing is a strategy. If you are working on something that cannot work, having brilliant, determined people work on it will not fix it. But once you have a good strategy, the quality of the people, the culture is 80% of what gets you there. And so try to be extremely invested in selecting wonderful colleagues, creating the perfect conditions for them to thrive and do a great job. Most people say they do this, but in reality, they don't really. If you ask them what percentage of the time you spend doing this, how much money, how many of your colleagues are focused on this sort of topics, rarely is it impressive. So I think that's an area where most of us can do better.
Okay, have you ever considered an IPO instead of that, or just raising equity?
Yeah, an IPO is a different tool to raise equity as a financing tool. Ultimately, it's certainly something we've considered multiple times. We keep evaluating. I think it's probably more likely than not that we will IPO at some point because it gives you better access to financing, and better access to financing, if used properly, means better outcomes for the company. Not just equity, by the way. If you're publicly traded as a company, also access to debt becomes a little bit better. So yes, definitely extensively considered multiple times.
And what has kept you from taking that step?
Well, it's not just pros. There are some cons, and the cons I think become smaller with time if you prepare for it. But for example, the reporting becomes, the requirements in terms of reporting become more cumbersome, substantially more cumbersome than as a private company, and so we are continually working toward being more ready. And the readier you are, the smaller that con becomes. But if you're not so ready, IPOing in 6 to 12 months means pouring a ton of resources into closing that gap, and those resources may be better spent on other fronts. And so that's been the case for us. There's also a matter of another disadvantage that I don't think will prevent us from doing it in the end, but it's worth mentioning, is your price, the price of a share becomes a lot more visible and a lot more volatile. And that can take a toll on you, on your team. People will be checking the stock ticker to see whether they're richer or poorer by the day. Managing that will be challenging. And so again, particularly if you're at a time where every increment of your attention has massive returns if directed to, in our case, the next acquisition, improving the platform, deciding to take that cost upon you, you can pay a pretty big price for it. So you need to make sure that the upside of being publicly traded more than compensates for it. And given that we've been able to access financing reasonably easily so far where we needed it, we haven't yet felt that it was so important. But as we scale and we need to raise not 700 million in debt, but maybe 10 billion at some point, and being publicly traded may be almost necessary to unlock that possibility.
Okay, I was wondering if you had an extra 10 minutes or if we have a hard stop.
I can ask the person I'm speaking to postpone by a few minutes. Let me do that.
Sure. Because there are a lot of questions coming through, and I want to try to touch on a couple more before we wrap up.
You'll have to be patient with me and just hold on while I send an email.
Sure.
Sorry, I'll only take 30 seconds. Okay, done.
Okay. So I guess I'll give you a question because I think you started your career at McKinsey before you built your first startup. And this question is related to, do you recommend fresh grads to work at a corporate before they launch their first startup, or just taking it right out of college and going?
Technically, I started as an entrepreneur because we started Evertail before I worked at McKinsey. The story is that we had no money, and I didn't really have a great desire to be a consultant. But despite McKinsey being a wonderful firm, and I highly recommend it for anybody interested in consulting, but we didn't have any money, and so the three of us, we needed at least one person to be working and pay for rent and food, while the other two worked full time on a prototype to raise VC funding. And so we looked at, all three looked for a job, and we decided that the person receiving the most lucrative offer would take it and pay for the other two, for the food and rent for the other two, while we raised the VC money, and then that person would resign and join the project full time. And so I happened to get an offer from McKinsey, which was the most lucrative of the options we had. And so I told actually the managing director, it was the Copenhagen office, that I was going to work on my startup in the nights and weekends, and that I planned to resign once, if ever, we could raise financing. And I was really afraid they would withdraw their offer, but they were incredibly gracious. I'm very, very grateful. They actually confirmed it with enthusiasm. So I worked there for about 1 year and 3 months. That was the most grueling period of my life. I was working 80 plus hour weeks at McKinsey and a good 30 hours at the startup. And then we raised initially €500,000 and a little bit later another $500,000 with Evertail, and then I completed my project with McKinsey and left. So yes, I did work as a consultant, but didn't start there, and it wasn't a vocation or anything. It was more a means to an end in my case. I would recommend working. I think if someone doesn't have immediately an idea, there's a tremendous desire to immediately jump into building a business, I think it's great to work at a corporate, particularly in a field where you're curious about. You have some nascent ideas, because if you become more knowledgeable about the field, you can better validate your ideas and determine whether they have a chance. And if you decide to implement them, then you'll have a substantial knowledge advantage at that point. I would recommend working, if possible, in either a very good corporation, or even better, perhaps a scale-up or startup. Generally, I would recommend optimizing for the quality of the people and the the field, probably in this order. Better to work with amazing people in a field you're not too interested in than vice versa. If you can work with amazing people in a field you're curious about, that would be perfect.
I love that you had your plan from day one. I didn't know that. And it was a group of 3 friends, I guess, kind of reading into the story, and you took the decision that you're going to take one for the team to kind of pay the rent and the food until you guys got your funding. Absolutely great.
We all took one for the team. I mean, I don't know that they had it easier in any way, but we're great friends. Actually, we lived together for 7 years throughout the whole project, a little bit before throughout Evertail, and for the first chunk of Ben Spoons, literally the same apartment until our girlfriends' wives, they just split us apart forcefully. That was painful, but very good friends, lifelong. I think it'll turn out.
And I think that's also a very important lesson, is a lot of people underestimate the importance of having co-founders that you have a very strong bond with, because it gets very grueling, it gets very difficult at times. And if you have people that you trust 100% and can rely on, it helps a lot during the process. Is there anything you wanted to add related to that?
No, amen. It's so true.
I guess we can do maybe one more question, and then I have one question from my end. How important is it to take big decisions quickly? Is it more important to be quick about your decision, or to think it through and make sure that you're making the right decision?
Yeah, I don't think there is a single answer. It depends, but I'm not a big fan of fast decision making. I know it's in vogue, highly publicized as a key quality of an entrepreneur. I'm actually a big believer in making relatively few important decisions really well. So I have a high sense of urgency, but I wouldn't rush a decision if I can make it better. Now, some caveats. First, you need to understand how much better it's going to get with time. Certain things are just highly unknowable, and there's no amount of testing, ponderation that you can make that will realistically improve your decision much. So if you have thought about it ad nauseum, you have been advised by the people you trust and can reasonably help you, and there are no other ways to acquire information, I would say just make it. Toss a coin if you can't decide, but there's no point waiting. However, often waiting is great. I'm a huge fan of procrastination. I work my ass off. Well, I mean it in a different way, procrastination. I mean, it's often by waiting, you gain information and you can make a much better decision. So if a decision, if the value of making it early is not too big, it's just important to make it well at some point. Often waiting will make the problem go away. Either you get the answer because the evidence will be overwhelming, or, and this is often the case, the decision that seems so important will become irrelevant. You'll be like, oh, wow, I actually don't need to make that decision any longer. That person has left. That project has become of negligible importance. The other thing to keep in mind, and I think that gives you a full picture, is how easy it is to undo the decision. If a decision, often by making the decision, you will gain, first of all, you take it off your plate. It's decided, let's move on. So you free up some RAM in your brain. And there's value in that. And second, you often learn more after you've made it. For example, you could be fearing that there will be a reaction from customers as opposed to a reaction from your teammates. Something will happen. So you'll see what happens. You'll know more. Many decisions are fairly easy to revert, or at least modify. Those are generally good to make fast and then go back to later. But also there are decisions that are really hard to undo, either because they impact your brand, your technological architecture in a way that's really costly to change, how you staff the position. Those I'm a big fan of typically thinking through quite thoroughly.
Okay, so I guess my last question before you wrap up, and I'm cognizant that we actually over on time. How important has Endeavor for you, and what kind of doors has it opened or opportunities?
I think it's been useful in a couple of ways. One is occasionally I've attended retreats or events, and I find that, in my view, being an entrepreneur can be very taxing emotionally. The pressure, the unknown, just the sheer amount of work. You're exhausted often, and that doesn't help being even keeled psychologically and emotionally. And sharing that insecurity, even suffering, you know, and perhaps too big a word, but I think sometimes it's perhaps appropriate, with other people who are in a similar situation helps make it more manageable. There's a saying in Italian, mal comune mezzo gaudio, which translates to a common evil is half a good thing. You know, like if we share some difficulty, we can probably laugh about it, or, you know, it seems easier to deal with in that case. So that's a big way Endeavor has helped me, I think. And then as you meet other people, and of course they share their, you know, challenges, sometimes you come up with you know, ideas or perspectives that perhaps you wouldn't have gotten to on your own, or it would have taken longer. So I can't say, it's hard for me to say, okay, Ben Spoons would be here or there without Endeavor. We entered relatively late. The trajectory was well set. I'm pretty confident we would have been somewhat successful anyway, but I'd like to think it helped make the trajectory a little bit steeper by supporting us in this couple of ways.
Okay. Thank you, Luca, for your time and for allowing us to run over. It's been enlightening for me. I hope it was enlightening for everyone else as well. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you. My pleasure, my honor, and also having so many busy people spending 1 hour with me. I don't take your attention for granted. I hope it was worth it.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Bye-bye.